And tonight, we want to celebrate that for the first time in the 92 history of the Academy Awards, a female conductor will be leading the orchestra for this performance.
Finally!
So here is Maestra Eimear Noone to conduct this year's nominated Best Original Scores.
Eimear. Sigourney Weaver get it right. Was I going to get it wrong? I was going to call you Eimear.
Well, I had a word to my mother about it, and she said, no, I can't change my name to what Sigourney wants to call me, so it's Eimear.
Well, Eimear, thank you very much for joining us today. That must have been such a thrill, was it, to get the opportunity. As was said, she forgot to mention years, but the first in 92 years of the Academy Awards, the Oscars, the first woman to be conducting the orchestra. How big a thrill was that for you?
It was an amazing experience. I mean, I knew that I was inhabiting a moment, and I knew that that moment had come on the shoulders of so many people. So that's what I took really seriously about it. Was I imagined myself as a little kid watching this and what I would want to see as a young musician and as a young Irish woman, what I would want to see on the screen. And I thought, this moment deserves to be respected by me and inhabited and relished, and I wanted to be present in that moment, and I didn't want to let the Irish girls down, so.
And was it what you wished for and hoped for?
It was. It was absolutely an amazing experience. I mean, creatively, musically. I knew most of the orchestra. I'd worked with them my whole career. I love a theatre. I love the orchestra pit. It's home, you know, it's a different type of weird home. But I enjoyed it so much. And the thing that I got out of it, I worked so hard on being mentally present and mentally owning the moment. And I feel that that's what I came out of it with. That was the gift that I got out of it. But it took a lot of work to get there, career-wise, mentally, technically, musically, everything.
And I want to get to your entrepreneurship in a little while, but I want to stay for a moment about this whole thing of being a conductor, because what is it about being a conductor? I mean, it looks flamboyant in many cases of the people waving the baton around. I mean, what actually does a conductor do? Because to many of us ignorant people, we might think, well, don't the various musicians have the sheet music in front of them? Aren't they just following that? What impact does the conductor have on them?
Well, it's non-verbal communication at its, ultimate, pushed as far as it can go. And it almost comes to a point where, I use my physicality to communicate with the orchestra. Of course, I can't make any sound. If I make a sound, then it gets in the way of the music. So I am using all of the nonverbal tricks that I can have. It's been interesting actually conducting with a mask on this period during the pandemic, because I feel like I've lost part of my nonverbal ability to communicate.
Why? Would you have been using your mouth always to mouth to people what they're supposed to do?
No, but it's the full expression. I mean, Botox is the enemy of the conductor. You know, that's not in my future, you know. We use every tiny little tick that you're giving off, the ultimate in body language. It's like dance, only the music is reacting to you instead of you reacting to the music. But there's a whole lot of nonverbal things going on. The eye contact is
But so what sort of messages are you trying to give to the members of your orchestra?
Not that. That's one of my favorite ones. But there's the nonverbal is saying, you know, basic things, tempo, but also you're creating an energy, you're creating an atmosphere that you want to bring all of these people. Every single person in front of me in the orchestra has postgraduate degrees in music. Everybody has an opinion about how it should be played. But my job is to bring everybody together in one direction to create something that's bigger than any one of us. And it's the ultimate in, imagine managing your team but not being allowed to speak any words to them to get them to move in one direction on a project.
Of course, you have in music, maybe more contemporary music, you have cover versions of the originals that people come to love. Is a composer in some respects in an orchestra doing a cover version of the original vision of the composer, putting their own mark on it?
I have never heard anyone put it like that before, man.
Is it that bad an analogy?
Cover version, it's great actually, because it depends on the type of music. Because when you're talking about classic repertoire, we have certain traditions, and without getting too technically musical about it, nowadays we put as much as we can into a score. But there's certain things that you cannot write down in music. There's certain things you can't write down. I'll give you an example. R&B music, we talk about the groove. In jazz, we talk about the groove. You cannot notate groove. You can notate the bones around which you groove, but you can't actually notate that human feel, or as we call it, when everything's going right and everybody's in the same zone, being in the pocket. You can't notate any of that. That comes from human beings being together and creating together. But for cover versions in terms of the classic repertoire, the composers notate and put down as much as they can, the basics. And then it's our job to research what would have been going on around that composer in that time. Performance practices of the day that we don't use anymore. If we want to be really authentic to the time period, we'll go back and use those. So many things. What was going through the composer's mind? What were they in their life? What was going on around them? We use every piece of information we can to be as authentic with our interpretation as possible.
And then for the Oscars, what music did you actually conduct? Because was it old movie scores or was it more recent songs that were nominated? Because again, it comes down to what interpretation do you put on those?
Oh, for me, it was the 5 nominees, and I couldn't have been happier. They were all in the audience. And these were the pieces that they had just written. I think this was the first live performance outside of the recording studio for the score that any of them had gotten.
Because of COVID?
No, because they're so new.
Right.
You know, what tends to happen with film music is at the very end of the film, once it has been edited, the composer writes the score. When you're watching the movie trailer for a film, the score hasn't been written for the actual film yet. So that's how close to the end it is. So these were the films that were nominated that year. And if a score becomes hugely popular, it may be performed on the concert stage, but there is a time period between the actual movie coming out and that happening. And it's based on fan reaction and so on. So this was the first actual live performance of these 5 pieces that I know of. And that was such an honor. And for me, these were my heroes. And to perform their music for them was beyond. I couldn't let myself think about it until afterwards, that kind of way.
You mentioned the non-verbal communication that you're doing with your orchestra, but what about as well the desire that perhaps maybe the audience has to see a performance from the conductor? Do you feel that there's a need for a conductor to be visible and showing their movement just to actually get part of the audience engaged as well?
Well, that's part of what I do, because I didn't come from a classical music family. I didn't come from a family of professional musicians. It was important for me, for your general concert goer or someone who's never been to see an orchestra, for them to get a hint at what I'm actually doing and what I'm communicating and why I'm doing it, and seeing the result of what my action is. And no matter what we do, if you're going to a concert, it's theatre. You're watching people, you're watching the movements, you're watching the blood, sweat and tears happen before you. And it was important to me to be able to bring the audience into my little secret world in a visual way. And every conductor chooses their own style, and it's how you represent yourself and your music in a unique way.
We were hearing earlier that there's only 3% of venture capitalists are women. How does the conducting business go for women? Because perhaps we have this image over the years of sort of long grey-haired old men doing it a lot of the time.
Well, it's so new that we don't even have any data. So that's where we are, and it's definitely less, I'd say less than 1%.
So how did you get into it? Because you're also a composer, and that's, I suppose, the main thing that we know you for, and we're going to talk about at length in a moment. But how did you get into conducting as well? What was the drive, and how difficult was it as a woman to get into doing that?
Well, I have a very visceral memory of walking past the TV. I was about 7 years of age, and seeing the guy with the big white curly hair and the tails in Vienna on a concert stage, and I was blown away by what I saw. I just couldn't believe it, and I went, okay, I'll do that. You know, it was as simple as that. I was about 7, and it was almost like everything after that was going towards that moment.
Yeah, but the innocence and naivety of a 7-year-old, did that not wear off along the way and start thinking, well, actually, this is going to be a bit too hard for me to do?
Oh, I am still that naive 7-year-old, absolutely. I remember writing my first week in career guidance, first week in high school, in secondary school, and Sister Mercedes, the nun who was our career guidance teacher. And of course, nuns have multiple careers. We had to write, you know, what I want to do when I grow up, kind of thing. And my first line was, I will conduct the orchestra at La Scala. Now that hasn't happened yet, but we're you know, we still have to.
And what reaction did you get to that from her?
I got, you know, you're good at science, maybe the medical side. Thanks to all of our brilliant med tech people today. They're my rock stars, they're amazing. But what I did is, as much as I loved science, as soon as I got to junior cert, I dropped my science subjects so everyone would leave me alone and let me do my music. And that's often an option with musicians. We did a survey in my class in Trinity, and we were asked, what would your other career be? There were only 2 answers. One was mathematics and the other was medicine, out of that class anyway. So it's quite common. And I remember the college orchestra, we had a lot of medical students playing in the orchestra as well. But when, you know, for me, instinct has been a huge driver in my career. Instinct and visualization and seeing myself doing something and living it emotionally. I mean, I've read books on visualization and realized I used to do that as a kid. I just thought of it as using my imagination. But it was the fact of seeing it as real and experiencing it as real in my imagination and feeling how it would be to be on that stage doing that. And, you know, putting on recordings and jumping around the room like an Egypt, you know, trying it out, see how it would feel, and feeling the music so deeply and getting the goosebumps and wanting to figure out, why is this making me feel this way?
You mentioned mathematics and medicine as other things that music students in Trinity might have gone for if they weren't doing music. But you did something very interesting in Trinity, which I suppose really showed your entrepreneurial bearing as well, in that you set up an orchestra. Now, why did you do that? And then what did you learn about business from the following 5 years with that orchestra?
Oh my goodness. So it's funny, I was coming up on the train today and I was writing an article on this very thing, and it's a strange, I think it has to be because I was coming here that I was thinking of it. But one of the things about conducting is you have to fail all the time in front of other musicians before you can get to a place where you're any good at it.
What do you mean by that? Explain that.
You can't practice without other musicians. You can learn technique, but you're practicing technique to nothing. You practice in silence. You practice with the score, you're reading it, it's in your head, and you're silence. So you're not understanding, you're not getting any feedback from your action until you're standing there, failing because you don't know what you're doing when you begin, in front of your colleagues. And that took tenacity, and that took, and that's something I'm passionate about, is helping people to feel safe in failing, because as a conductor, you have to do that over and over and over and over in order to prove, in order to practice, you need 80 other people. So I wasn't waiting for someone to jump out of my closet and say, you're really talented, here, have an orchestra, because that is never going to happen. So a classmate of mine, Gillian Saunders, a cellist, and we were both very passionate about film scores and how they made us feel and the emotional aspect of film scores. In classic music, we have a term that is program music, and it's using music to paint a picture or solicit an emotion from the listener. And that today is alive in film music and video game music in particular. Concert music, yes, also. However, we use it specifically in collaborative music with other media to solicit emotion from the audience, to foreshadow something that's about to happen in the action, to plant the audience in this imaginative world that might have nothing to do with the real world. And this was fascinating to both of us. So we decided we wanted to put on a concert of film scores that we hadn't seen in Ireland yet, and classic repertoire that was used in film, because neither of us came from music families, and we wanted to share some of our favorite classic music in a way that made sense to absolutely everybody. And what we did was we set up the orchestra. We got all of our friends from the College of Music, from Trinity, from UCD, from all the music departments, a lot of Irish Youth Orchestra people at the time, everybody together. We went and I called up the music publishers, I called up composers in LA. I was 19 when we started. Our debut concert.
So you're asking for permission to actually use the music, to negotiate payments?
Yes, we had to negotiate rental of scores. I made friends with the librarian for the RTE orchestras who helped me find out who was who. And it was a cajole, call, convince. We didn't know what we were doing. We were figuring it out as we went along.
You also had to get venues and you had to sell tickets to cover your costs.
So we booked the National Concert Hall. The article I was writing this morning was for the National Concert Hall. We booked the National Concert Hall.
How much chutzpah is involved in a 19-year-old and her friend who are musical students going and saying, can we book the National Concert Hall, please, because we're putting together an orchestra that's going to play film scores there?
I'll never forget that phone call. I'll never forget. I think I did a little bit of the deepening your voice to make you a little more credible thing on the phone. I remember them saying, you must sell 1,000 tickets or we'll never have you back. Now, I say that to the concert hall people that I know now, and they laugh because, this is a different regime, but it was 1,000 tickets. We thought, oh my God, here we were, the raggle-taggle gypsies of orchestral music. We were literally doing takedowns of parts and handwriting parts and photocopying them. And I was putting out chairs and doing everything. We had a budget for marketing this concert of €250. That was our budget. And we resented having to spend it on anything outside of the music. So Colin Connolly from RTE came to our rescue. And he did a piece on the lawns in Trinity while we were rehearsing in, the room, Regent Hall, just above Front Square, just above the front arch. That's where we were rehearsing. We were rehearsing the music from Batman. Danny Elfman's score to Batman. It was reverberating all around Front Square. And there he is lying on the grass with the microphone. deep in the heart of Trinity College, you know, ba-da-da-dee-da-da. And he sold out the house for us. People were fascinated. What are these two mad students doing? I was 21. And we had to sell out the house because the only way we were going to pay for the concert was to sell out the house. Every single ticket had to be sold. And we did. And it was terrifying, absolutely terrifying. I remember being so tired that we got a standing ovation at the end of the concert. It was one of those, you know, movie moments. And a lot of the movie industry showed up. We had John Borman agreed to be an honorary patron, Noel Pearson, composer Elmer Bernstein was in Dublin, popped into Dublin, and we convinced him to be a patron before he passed away. And we were so cheeky. You know, it was chutzpah, you know, on steroids, you know. And it's funny, I was thinking about this earlier on today. People say to me, you know, when you were a student, do you ever think you'd make it to the Oscars? And if you were to say to that student conducting John Williams at the concert hall, you know, and this is going to sound really strange, if you're going to say to that student, one day you will conduct John Williams for John Williams sitting in the audience at the Academy Awards, that student would have said, well, yeah, that's the logical conclusion to where we are right now.
You had that much ambition and that much confidence.
It wasn't confidence. It wasn't confidence at all. It was definitely naivete. It was, in my mind, it was logic. If you put in the work, if you go in this direction with this. And it was all based on the music. It wasn't ambition towards career. It wasn't ambition about, I'm going to drive a big fast car and have a big house and show the world I've arrived. It was nothing to do with that. It was about myself and my friend Jill. We'd put on these scores and we would just go, imagine playing this. Imagine being in the middle of this. Imagine putting this, imagine so-and-so and so-and-so in the audience listening to this. They're gonna love it, you know? It was totally driven by that. And for me, the logical conclusion for that, the biggest hit of that would be to perform that music for those composers. That would be the logical end to that. And it's not hubris, it's total naivete. I had no idea how hard it would be to get there, absolutely none.
You did it for 5 years with that orchestra in Dublin, then you decided to go to Los Angeles. What sent you to Los Angeles?
I got a job. I was hired thanks to the brilliant organisation we have here in Ireland called Screen Skills Ireland. It was Screen Training Ireland at the time. Alongside my degree, I did a film scoring program that was run by Screen Skills Ireland. And one of the composers was a professional orchestrator that they brought over, hired me based on my work in the class, basically, hired me as his assistant. And I was brought over on a project basis initially to work as an orchestrator and conduct the sessions. So what an orchestrator does is you take a composer who doesn't come from the orchestral world. It's one of the types of jobs we do. It's the main one. Doesn't come from the orchestral world, but is working on a project that requires them to express themselves through the medium of the orchestra. So they'll come to an orchestrator with their main ideas, their harmonies, their melodies, their rhythms, their counterpoint, and our job is to interpret that for the orchestra and make it playable. And you know, this is the world I live in. You know, my first job was playing in orchestra pits at 14, so that was my first job. And my first job as an orchestrator happened to be on the very first World of Warcraft video game.
Now, you're going to have to explain to some people what World of Warcraft actually is.
World of Warcraft is what we call an MMO, a massive multiplayer online game. And it's an RPG, also a role-playing game. And these games exist online where you have people from all over the world can form a guild or a team that goes on these quests together. And World of Warcraft, it has its own sort of mythology and its own characters, and it's very, very deep. When it had its 10th anniversary 5 or 6 years ago, it had had over 100 million individual players in 10 years. It is a huge, we had no idea at the time how huge it would be, And the exciting thing for me is that's 100 million people listening to orchestral music all over the world. And being excited about orchestral music. I've toured the world performing some of the music that we recorded back then. So it's...
Well, I'll get back to that and say, but it actually just strikes me, is this the way to perhaps save orchestral music for generations to come, in that, you know, classical music is not as popular as it once was for people going to performances. But I'm thinking of things like bringing my own children to classical performance of Star Wars music, because that's what they wanted to see, and they probably hadn't been at anything else. That via movies and via games, that you can actually save the interest in classical music.
Well, more young people listen to orchestral music through their game consoles today than have ever listened to orchestral music in the history of music. If you think of it, back in Mozart's day, there was no recording. So today, the amount of orchestral music recorded every year for video games is enormous. I've recorded, you know, hundreds of hours of orchestral music for video games at this point. And it's really interesting because it imprints. When you're living inside of a game score, when you're living with a game, people don't play it for 2 hours and then it's done like a film. They live with it for as long as it takes. And that could be weeks, it could be months, it could be, in the case of World of Warcraft, it could be years. And what happens is the sonority of the orchestra imprints as this is no longer the music of our grandparents. I have literally shaken hands with this is interesting in the post-COVID times, but literally shaken hands with tens of thousands of video game music fans. And they always want to tell me what their favorite song is. It's always referred to as a song, whether they're singing or not. My favorite song is the music from Skyrim. My favorite song is the music from World of Warcraft, from Zelda, whatever. And I'll say to them, well, then does that mean that your favorite band is the orchestra? And the reaction is always, I never thought of it that way, but I guess so. And that's really exciting to me because this is the musical sonority that I absolutely love. And I love deeply my classic music. I love my Brahms, I love my Bruckner, I love my Mendelssohn. And it's exciting for me to share those things with kids that are now predisposed to being okay with the sonority, the color, the sound of the orchestra through their video games.
So tell us about writing for video games, because this is where you've developed a sizable business for yourself,
Yes.
that you are one of the world leaders in this particular field. So what is it that you actually are looking to do, and how do you do it?
Well, it depends. It depends on who you're working with. It depends on what type of video game.
If it's a children's game, or if it's a young adult or an adult game.
It depends on the type of, where is the game going to live? Is it VR? Is it a console game? Is it an online game? What is it? Is it a mobile game? And for me, it's really interesting because I really deal in expressive, let's call it expressive orchestral music, which means I write for film, I write for TV, I write for video games. And it's an interesting collaborative process because you are working with visuals, and that's great from a creative perspective because I have a starting point that's inspirational that I can look at. Sometimes when you're dealing with animation and animatics, it could be just stick men voiced by one of the animators who may or may not be a good actor, you know, and you're trying to conceive of this giant orchestral epic sound. And sometimes it's fully rendered animation. But it's always about how to express and how to bring in the audience. And what point of view are you taking as the composer? Are you taking the point of view of the player and what they're doing, and what they're seeing, and where they are, and what environment they're in? Are you taking the point of view of an omniscient being who's standing back and watching the entire thing unfold? And in film, we can play around with that. We can create what we call foreshadowing. You have your characters driving a car, the sun's shining, the birds are singing, he's happy. You can score his happiness, that's his point of view. Or you can score from the perspective of an omniscient being who knows that he's coming home to really bad news, and you can foreshadow what's about to happen. So it's really interesting because there's a lot of psychology involved. But in terms of business,
So just before you get to the business of it, do the directors of the movies and the games and the producers, do they then sort of have strong opinions as to what you provide to them? Or do they actually really, if they're visual people and storytellers, do they get the musical element and the importance of
I'm
it?
smiling because I'm thinking of Donald Scannell backstage, who will tell you that directors don't have any opinions ever on anything. So, of course, and it's, you know, we have, it depends on the director's background, and also it's a sort of, you have to meet your sort of aesthetic soulmates. That you're coming from the same sort of aesthetic perspective. As in, one of the first things I'll do when I meet a director is ask them for their top 10 favorite songs. Because that gives me a sense of, oh, they were a grunger in their teen years, or they're a metalhead, or they're a jazzer, or they're whatever they react to. Because music is such a personal thing. And it's such a visceral thing. I don't know why I love Metallica, I just do, you know. I don't know why I love Stravinsky, I just do. And it hits you on both, it's first, I think it's visceral first, and then it's intellectual. I go, oh, I love the way he did that, or I love the way, but it's after I'm already captivated viscerally. So that's really important, that you're dealing with somebody that you're on the same wavelength as, or that you can get on their wavelength. But it's endlessly interesting, endlessly.
So you were going to elaborate on the business development and how you've developed a business out of this.
Well, we're a cottage industry in our house. Myself, my composer, or my husband comes first, composer comes second, apparently. My husband's also, he's an Emmy-nominated composer, he's a music producer. We have been working on moving from being the hired guns, and this is why I love big ideas, moving from being the hired guns to creating our own IPs and creating our own projects that we can create in this, I think of Ireland as our laboratory, our wonderful, safe environment that then we can project out onto the world stage.
So what sort of IPs or intellectual properties are you looking to develop?
So creative IPs are everything that you experience after. If you're working 9 to 5 in your job, everything that happens, we're the ones that create everything that you experience after your day's work, outside of life events. So you get in the car, you turn on the radio, the music you hear, all of that is creative IP. The programs that you hear on the radio are creative IP. You go home, you open a book, that's a creative IP. You turn on your TV, you play a video game. The patterns on your wallpaper is a creative IP, all of these things. So it's all about owning what you create and creating something that can generate and move out and out and out. For instance, when we create a piece of music, that piece of music is traveling when we're working on the next thing. So that piece of music, say it's in a film, it's shown in cinemas, it's generating IP, which then comes back to Ireland. Then it changes format. It's now on the streamers after going to cinemas. That generates a different income for that IP. It comes back to wherever that IP's home is. It's Ireland. So then it goes from there, from the streamers. The music, it becomes concerts, and that tours all over the world. That comes back to Ireland. Then say the film generates merchandise. My music is in the toy that's sold as part of the merch for the film. That's creating more revenue. That's creating more revenue. But so long as you're in the services side of things, you're creating that revenue for somebody else. Whereas our thing at the moment, our big idea is to go from constantly being the hired guns to creating the IP, creative IP. And one of the things that is my passion in Ireland, because it just makes too much sense to me, is the video game industry, an industry that is worth digitally $100 billion a year, and when we add hardware, 100 to 300 and upwards of $300 billion a year.
And I think that was recognised in the recent budget as well, that Minister Paschal Donohoe was aware of the impact of the industry here in Ireland. So you're now back to spending more time in Ireland, I believe. You have been living in Malibu, which I say many people would envy your opportunity to live in Malibu in Los Angeles for many years, but you now split your time between it and Galway.
Yes, we came home to work on a magnificent Irish film produced out of Galway, European co-production called 2x2 Overboard by Motion Films. Absolutely world-class work. And literally in the middle of recording the score, we were locked down on. And we decided to stay. We decided we feel safer here. We feel safest in East Galway. So we decided to stay. And then because we stayed, we started looking around and going, what about this? What about that? There's amazing things happening in the audiovisual sector in the West right now. We're involved there in lots of different projects. So what happened was we decided we're going to split the year in two, but we're going to move our company from the United States to Galway. And we're going to see, we're going to feel that out. There's amazing things happening. The film tax credit is wonderful. It's 32% in Ireland, but in the West, we have an extra 5%. Now extending the tax credit to the video game industry is a first small step. That will facilitate more service work coming in. But the goose that lays the golden egg is the IP and generating new IP in Ireland. There's a city in Japan called Kyoto. And Kyoto is a city where they've created endlessly. They understand the power of creative IP. I know because I've just spent my Christmas present money for my kids and bought the stuffed Pikachu from Kyoto and bought the Nintendo Switch and bought the Nintendo wheelie thingy, I forgot what it's called, and bought the games because that's all part of the Nintendo creative IP, and that's one city in Japan. We could do that in Ireland.
And are you investing in facilities here in Ireland as well?
We are actually. We're building a dub stage.
What's a dub stage?
A dub stage is where we recreate cinematic conditions for sound so that we can mix our sound and our music as you will hear it in the cinema. And we're doing that in East Galway. We just hired a young composer we just added to our staff a new assistant who's Irish, and she's very, very talented, and I'm excited about her work. And I look around, I've seen, so much of what the power of the video game industry, and I look at it and I go, it involves technology and support around technology. It involves writers, directors, developers, producers, composers, actors. These are places that we excel. And this is a massive, massive industry. Yes, we have this tax break in the budget and we have this hub that's happening in Sligo, but those are wonderful first small steps and they're very exciting.
We're coming to the conclusion here, but we started by talking about your performance at the Oscars, but clearly that was not an end point for you. That's only a journey on what you intend to be, or a destination on a very long journey.
That was a fun moment. Yeah, and that's sort of in my head. That's what it was. Is a really, really fun moment. But creatives, this is who we are. It's not what we do. We can't stop being who we are.
So, what are your ambitions, though?
Oh gosh, I never think of ambitions. I just think of projects that I would really like to see happen, and everything for me is instinct. How I feel about an idea. And I think every single person that presented here today, I could see that in them. They're passionate. It's that energy is the difference between something being an idea and actually being physically there in the palm of your hand. And that's for me. I have the project driven is where I am. It's that same thing of sitting down with my friend Jill and listening to the music and imagining what it would be like to inhabit it.
Eimear Noone, it's been tremendous having the opportunity to talk to you. It was absolutely fascinating and insightful stuff. Thank you very much for being with us today for the big ideas.